Go to a nursing home or make a room in your car. Pick one, Dad, my son said with a scornful smile. I stayed calm, smiled, and packed my things. An hour later, a Rolls-Royce pulled up. When he opened the door and saw who came for me, his smile vanished. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Joseph, and I'm 65 years old. This morning, my son Carl looked me straight in the eye and delivered words that cut deeper than any blade ever could. Go to a nursing home or make room in your car. Pick one, Dad. The casual cruelty in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in the kitchen of what used to be our family home, watching my 38-year-old son lean against the granite countertop with that familiar expression of contempt. His designer suit was perfectly pressed, his hair styled with the kind of gel that costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Everything about him screamed success, everything except his character. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply nodded and said, I understand. Carl's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised by my calm response. I think he expected tears, maybe begging, perhaps some dramatic scene where I'd remind him of all the sacrifices I'd made over the years. But I'd learned long ago that words rarely change a hardened heart, and Carl's heart had turned to stone somewhere along the way. Just like that? He asked, his voice carrying a note of disappointment. Maybe he wanted the drama. Maybe he needed to feel more justified in what he was doing. Just like that, I replied, already mentally cataloging what I'd need to pack. I walked past him toward the stairs, my feet heavy on each step. Behind me, I heard him mutter something to his wife Jessica about how I was finally being reasonable for once. Jessica laughed. That brittle sound she made when she was nervous or trying too hard to fit in. She'd never liked me, not since the day Carl brought her home 5 years ago. To her, I was just an obstacle between her and complete control over Carl's life. My bedroom felt smaller than usual as I pulled out the old leather suitcase from under the bed. The same suitcase I'd used 35 years ago when I first moved to this town, young and hopeful, carrying nothing but dreams and a determination to build something meaningful for my future family. As I folded my clothes, memories flooded back. I remembered Carl at 5 years old running to me when I came home from work, his little arms wrapping around my legs as he babbled about his day. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, holding the back of the seat as he wobbled forward, my back aching but my heart full. I remembered sitting up all night when he had pneumonia at 8, watching his small chest rise and fall, praying to any god who'd listen to keep my boy safe. Where had that little boy gone? When had he transformed into this cold stranger who could look at his father and see nothing but a burden? The answer came to me as I packed my old work shirts. It happened gradually, starting in high school when Carl discovered that other kids' fathers drove luxury cars and wore expensive watches. He began asking questions I couldn't answer the way he wanted. Why didn't we live in the big houses across town? Why did I drive a 10-year-old Toyota instead of a BMW? Why did other dads seem so much more successful? I tried to explain that success wasn't measured by possessions, that what mattered was character, kindness, the relationships we built. But teenage Carl wasn't interested in philosophy. He wanted status, and I was failing to provide it. College made it worse. Carl went to state school because that's what we could afford, while his high school friends headed off to prestigious private universities. He'd come home for breaks increasingly resentful, comparing our modest life to the wealth he saw in his classmates' families. After graduation, Carl worked his way up in real estate, and I was proud of him. He was driven, ambitious, everything I'd tried to instill in him about hard work and determination, but success changed him. The more money he made, the more embarrassed he seemed by his humble origins. When he married Jessica, the transformation was complete. She came from money, old money that looked down on people like us. Suddenly, I wasn't Carl's father anymore. I was his inconvenient past, a reminder of the modest life he'd escaped. Now, as I packed my few possessions, I wondered if there had been any point where I could have made different choices. Should I have pushed harder for that promotion years ago? Should I have taken bigger risks, chased more money? Would Carl respect me more if I'd been wealthy? The question felt hollow because I knew the answer. I'd made the choices I could live with, choices that let me sleep at night with a clear conscience. If that wasn't enough for Carl, then perhaps the problem wasn't with my choices. I was nearly finished packing when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Carl appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're really doing this?" he asked. "You gave me two options," I said quietly, continuing to fold clothes. This seemed like the dignified choice. He shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, just a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, maybe. Or regret. But it passed quickly, replaced by that familiar hardness. "Look, Dad, this isn't personal. It's just practical. Jessica and I need space, and you're getting older. It makes sense for you to be somewhere with proper care." I almost laughed at the word care. When had Carl last shown me any care? When had he asked about my health, my feelings, my needs? But I said nothing. "I've already looked into some places," he continued, pulling out his phone. "There's a facility, about 20 minutes away. It's clean, affordable, they have activities." Activities? Like I was a child who needed to be entertained rather than a man who'd spent 40 years working, paying taxes, contributing to society. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, meaning none of it. Carl looked relieved, probably thinking this was going easier than he'd expected. He started to leave, then turned back. "Dad, this really is for the best. You'll see." I met his eyes and smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to confuse him. "I'm sure you're right, son." And in a way, he was. This was for the best, though not for the reasons he imagined. As I finished packing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of anticipation. Change was coming, and maybe, just maybe, it would bring clarity to a situation that had been clouded for far too long. I closed the suitcase and took one last look around the room where I'd slept for over 3 decades. Tomorrow, everything would be different. The question was, would Carl be ready for just how different it would be? The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. I was awake before dawn, sitting on the edge of the bed I'd slept in for the last time, watching the first gray light of morning filter through curtains I'd hung myself 22 years ago. Carl had left early for work, probably to avoid any awkward goodbyes. Jessica had made herself scarce too, though I heard her moving around downstairs, no doubt mentally redecorating the space I was vacating. I had a few hours before my departure, and something pulled me toward the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, but suddenly I felt an overwhelming need to retrieve something I'd stored away long ago, something I'd hoped never to need again. The attic ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up into the dusty space. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in my careful handwriting: Christmas decorations, Carl's school projects, photo albums. But I wasn't looking for any of those. I was looking for a small metal filing cabinet pushed into the far corner, hidden behind old furniture and forgotten memories. It took me 20 minutes to move enough stuff to reach it. When I finally pulled it free, my hands trembled as I opened the top drawer. Inside, exactly where I'd left them 35 years ago, were the documents that told the real story of who Joseph Wellington actually was. The first document was a birth certificate, but not the one Carl had seen when he needed it for his passport. This was the original, bearing the name Joseph Marcus Wellington III, born in Newport, Rhode Island, to Joseph Marcus Wellington II and Eleanor Vanderbilt Wellington. The same Wellington family that owned half of downtown Providence and had summer homes that appeared in architectural magazines. The second document was a trust fund statement dated 35 years ago, showing a balance that made my hands shake. Even then, it had been worth $8 million. God only knew what it was worth now with 35 years of compound interest and careful management. The third document was the one that hurt the most to read, even after all these years. It was a letter, written in my own handwriting, to my parents' lawyer. In it, I formally renounced my claim to the Wellington inheritance, asking that my name be removed from all family trusts and legal documents. I wanted nothing that connected me to the cold, sterile world I'd grown up in. I was 28 when I wrote that letter, devastated by my wife Sarah's death and determined to raise Carl somewhere far from the suffocating expectations and hollow values of old money. Sarah had been different from the women in my family's social circle. She'd been warm, genuine, interested in people rather than profit margins. When she died in that car accident, taking our unborn daughter with her, I'd felt like my world ended. My parents hadn't helped. Tragic, of course, my mother had said at the funeral, but now you can move forward. The Ashford girl would be suitable, or perhaps someone from the Morgan family. She'd been talking about remarrying before we'd even buried Sarah. That's when I'd made my decision. I liquidated my small personal inheritance, the money that was mine outright rather than tied up in family trusts. It gave me about $400,000, enough to disappear completely. I changed my name from Wellington to Hartwell, moved to this small town in Ohio, and set about creating a new life built on different values. I'd worked as a high school history teacher, then eventually as a principal. The work was meaningful, the pay modest but sufficient. I lived quietly, raised Carl to appreciate simple things, tried to instill in him the values I wished I'd learned growing up. Hard work, humility, kindness to others regardless of their bank account balance. What I'd never told him was that every month on the 15th I received a certified letter from Whitmore, Blackstone & Associates, my family's law firm. They'd been tracking me all these years, sending updates on the trust funds I'd abandoned. My father had died 12 years ago, my mother 8 years ago. My younger brother had died in a skiing accident 5 years ago, childless. The letters had become increasingly urgent in recent years. I was the last Wellington heir. The family fortune, now worth hundreds of millions, was sitting in trusts with no one to claim it. The lawyers were required by law to continue attempting to contact me until I officially claimed or permanently declined the inheritance. I'd ignored every letter, filed them away in this cabinet without opening most of them. Money hadn't been able to buy my parents' love or genuine happiness. It hadn't saved Sarah or our daughter. What good would it do me now? But as I sat in that dusty attic, reading through documents that proved I could have given Carl everything he'd ever wanted materially, I began to see my choice differently. Had I been noble in rejecting wealth, or had I been selfish? Had I deprived my son of opportunities by forcing him to grow up poor when I could have provided for him in ways most people could only dream of? The guilt was overwhelming. All those times Carl had complained about our modest lifestyle, all those moments when he'd seemed embarrassed by our simple home and my ordinary job, he'd been right to feel resentful. I'd been sitting on a fortune that could have sent him to any college, bought him any car, given him entry to social circles he'd yearned to join. But even as the guilt washed over me, I remembered why I'd made that choice. I'd wanted Carl to have something my wealth could never have given him. Character shaped by struggle, empathy developed through understanding what it meant to work for what you had, humility that came from not being handed everything on a silver platter. Looking at who Carl had become, working his way up through real estate, I'd thought my approach had succeeded. He was driven, ambitious, successful on his own merits. But this morning's conversation had shown me the truth. Carl hadn't developed character despite our modest circumstances. He'd developed resentment. All those years, he'd been ashamed of me, of us, of the life I'd chosen for him. I pulled out the most recent letter from the law firm, dated just 6 weeks ago. This one was different from the others. It wasn't just an update on trust fund balances. It was a notification that after 40 years of patient waiting, the firm was prepared to take final action. If I didn't respond within 60 days, they would publish legal notices in major newspapers, effectively forcing me to claim the inheritance or watch it go to charity according to the original trust documents. 60 days. I checked the date. 53 days had already passed. In 1 week, my face would be in newspapers across the country as lawyers tried to track down the missing Wellington heir. I sat back against a dusty box, papers scattered around me, and tried to process what this meant. Carl was throwing me out because he saw me as a burden, a poor old man with no resources and nowhere to go. In 1 week, he'd discover that his failure of a father was actually one of the wealthiest men in New England. The irony was almost too much to bear. For 35 years, I'd lived simply by choice, teaching Carl that money wasn't the measure of a man's worth. And now, as he rejected those values and rejected me, fate was preparing to prove just how wrong his assumptions had been. But what should I do with this knowledge? Part of me wanted to march downstairs and throw these documents in Carl's face to show him exactly what kind of fool he was being. But that would be petty, vengeful, everything I'd tried not to be. Another part of me wanted to continue ignoring the inheritance, to let it go to charity as I'd always planned. If Carl could only love me for my money, then perhaps he wasn't worth saving anyway. But as I sat there surrounded by the evidence of my hidden past, I began to think about a third option. What if this wasn't about punishment or reward? What if this was simply about truth? Carl had made his choice based on incomplete information. Didn't he deserve to know who his father really was before he finalized his decision to throw me away? I carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in the filing cabinet. I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. But as I climbed back down the attic ladder, I knew that in just a few hours something was going to change forever. The question was, would Carl be ready for the truth about his father? And more importantly, would I be ready for his reaction when he learned that everything he thought he knew about our family had been a carefully constructed lie? I was placing my suitcase by the front door when I heard the sound that would change everything. The low, purring hum of an expensive engine pulling into our modest driveway. I glanced out the window and felt my breath catch in my throat. A pristine black Rolls-Royce Phantom sat in the driveway like something from another world. Its chrome gleamed in the afternoon sun, the Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament catching the light as if announcing the arrival of royalty. In our neighborhood of middle-class homes and 10-year-old sedans, it looked as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. I heard Jessica's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen. "Carl!" she called out, her voice tight with curiosity and something else. Fear, maybe. "There's a Rolls-Royce in our driveway." Carl appeared from his home office, still in his shirt and tie from his morning meetings, his face wearing the same expression of bewildered concern that I imagined was on mine. Well, almost the same expression. Unlike Carl, I had a growing suspicion about who might be stepping out of that magnificent vehicle. The driver's door opened with the whispered precision that only comes from German engineering and meticulous craftsmanship. But it wasn't a chauffeur who emerged. It was a woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people made in 3 months. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to boardrooms and country clubs. I recognized her immediately, even though 35 years had passed since I'd last seen her. Margaret Whitmore, senior partner at Whitmore, Blackstone and Associates, and the lawyer who had been sending me those certified letters for decades. "Dad," Carl said slowly, not taking his eyes off the woman approaching our front door, "do you know who that is?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Not the sharp buzz of our ordinary doorbell, but somehow even that sounded more dignified when announced by Margaret Whitmore's presence. Carl shot me a confused look, then walked to the door. I followed, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Behind us, Jessica hovered like a moth drawn to flame, her earlier coldness toward me temporarily forgotten in the face of this mystery. Carl opened the door to find Margaret standing there with a manila folder in her manicured hands and an expression of professional warmth that I remembered well from my youth. "Good afternoon," she said in the crisp Boston accent that spoke of Harvard law and old money breeding. "I'm Margaret Whitmore from Whitmore, Blackstone and Associates. I'm looking for Mr. Joseph Hartwell." The silence that followed was deafening. Carl's mouth opened and closed without sound. Jessica pressed closer, her eyes wide with questions she didn't know how to ask. "That would be me," I said quietly, stepping forward. Margaret's composed expression cracked just slightly, revealing what might have been relief or satisfaction. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, and then her voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Or should I say Mr. Wellington?" The name hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Carl's head snapped toward me, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," Carl said quickly, his real estate training kicking in as he tried to manage an impossible situation. "My father's name is Joseph Hartwell, not Wellington, and we certainly don't know anyone from—" He glanced at the business card Margaret had handed him, his voice faltering as he read the letterhead. "Whitmore, Blackstone and Associates." Margaret's smile was patient, the kind lawyer's perfect when dealing with complicated family situations. "There's no mistake, Mr. Hartwell. Your father and I have a great deal to discuss." She turned to me. "Mr. Wellington, I've been trying to reach you for quite some time. May I come in?" I could feel Carl's eyes boring into me, demanding explanations I wasn't ready to give. Jessica had gone completely pale, as if she'd suddenly realized that the poor old man she'd been so eager to see gone might not be quite what he seemed. "Of course," I said, stepping back to let Margaret enter. "Please come in." She walked into our modest living room with the same composure she'd have shown entering a palace. Her eyes took in everything. The furniture we'd bought at discount stores, the family photos in frames from the drugstore, the simple lifestyle I'd chosen and maintained for 35 years. "This is quite charming," she said, and I could tell she meant it. Margaret had always been able to appreciate authenticity, even when it came wrapped in simplicity. Carl was still standing by the door, the business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline. "I don't understand what's happening here," he said, his voice tight. "Dad, who is this woman? What does she want?" Margaret looked at me expectantly. This was my moment, my choice. I could ask her to leave, continue. The charade let Carl throw me out as planned. Or I could let 35 years of carefully maintained secrets finally see the light of day. "Margaret," I said slowly, "this is my son Carl and his wife Jessica." "Carl, Jessica, this is Margaret Whitmore. She represents the Wellington family legal interests." "Wellington," Carl repeated the name like he was tasting something unfamiliar. "Dad, what are you talking about? Our name is Hartwell." Margaret opened her folder and pulled out a document. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell, your father's legal name is Joseph Marcus Wellington III. He's the sole surviving heir to the Wellington family fortune." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I'm here to inform him that the trust funds established by his grandfather and managed by our firm for the past 40 years have reached a point where legal action is required." Jessica made a small, strangled sound. Carl just stared, his face going through a fascinating array of expressions as his brain tried to process information that didn't fit into any category he understood. "Trust funds," he said faintly. "Multiple trust funds," Margaret confirmed. "Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, business interests. The total current value is approximately—" She consulted another document. $467 million. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. Jessica sat down heavily on our old couch, her face the color of ash. Carl remained frozen by the door, still holding Margaret's business card. "I'm sorry," Carl said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you just say $467 million? "That's correct," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "Plus accumulated interest, dividend payments, and appreciation on various holdings that haven't been calculated into that figure. The actual total is likely closer to $500 million. Carl turned to me, and for the first time in years, I saw him truly look at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. The man he'd dismissed as a failure, a burden, someone whose modest teacher's pension wasn't worth the space I took up in his house. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "is this real?" Before I could answer, Margaret continued, "Your father renounced his claim to the family fortune 35 years ago. We've been attempting to contact him ever since, as required by law. The trust documents specify that if no claim is made by his 43rd birthday, the funds will be distributed to designated charities." She looked at me with something that might have been admiration. That deadline passed 22 years ago, but we've continued attempting contact out of professional courtesy. But now, she continued, the last remaining family member, your father's brother Charles, passed away 5 years ago. Mr. Wellington is the sole surviving heir, and Massachusetts law requires us to make a final formal attempt at contact. If he doesn't respond within 7 days, the inheritance will be permanently transferred to charity. 7 days. The same timeline I'd calculated from the letter in the attic. Carl was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Dad," he said slowly, "you're telling me that this morning when you said I could choose between a nursing home or your car, you were sitting on $500 million?" I met his eyes, seeing confusion, disbelief, and something else beginning to dawn. Recognition, perhaps, of just how badly he'd misjudged the situation. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, son." The weight of that truth settled over the room like a heavy blanket. 35 years of sacrifice, of choosing principle over comfort, of raising my son to value character over wealth, all of it leading to this moment when everything he thought he knew about his father crumbled around him. Margaret was watching this family drama unfold with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen similar scenes play out in wealthy families before. But I could see the question in her eyes, the same question that was probably racing through Carl's mind. What was I going to do now? The silence in our living room was broken only by the steady tick of the old grandfather clock I'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago. Carl was still standing by the door, Margaret's business card trembling in his hand, while Jessica sat on our worn couch looking like she might faint at any moment. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Perhaps," she said diplomatically, "we should sit down and discuss the specifics." I took my usual chair, the one with the small tear in the armrest that I'd been meaning to repair for months. Margaret sat across from me, with the poise of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. Carl finally moved, walking slowly to the couch beside his wife, his eyes never leaving my face. "Before we continue," I said, looking directly at Carl, "you should understand why I never told you any of this." Carl's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "I think I'd like to hear that explanation. Yes." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 35 years of secrecy. "When your mother died, I was 28 years old and completely lost. I'd grown up in a world where money solved everything except the things that actually mattered. Love, genuine relationships, real purpose. My parents saw your mother's death as an inconvenience, something to be managed and moved past as quickly as possible." Margaret nodded slightly as if she remembered the family dynamics I was describing. "I decided I wanted something different for you," I continued. "I wanted you to grow up understanding the value of work, of earning what you had, of measuring success by character rather than bank account balance." Carl's face had gone through several shades of red. "So you let me think we were poor? You let me work my way through state school when you could have sent me to Harvard? You watched me struggle to build my business when you had enough money to buy the entire real estate market?" "I watched you become strong," I said quietly. "I watched you develop work ethic and determination. I watched you build something real with your own hands." "That's insane," Carl exploded, jumping to his feet. "Do you have any idea what I went through? The embarrassment, the struggle, the nights I stayed awake worrying about money?" Margaret cleared her throat gently. "If I may," she interjected, "perhaps I could explain exactly what your father gave up when he walked away from the Wellington family." She opened the first folder and spread several documents across our coffee table. "The Wellington Trust was established in 1897 by your great-great-grandfather, who made his fortune in shipping and later railroads. By the time your father was born, the family controlled significant portions of downtown Providence, Boston, and Newport." I watched Carl lean forward, his anger temporarily replaced by fascination as Margaret continued. "Your father was the heir to all of it. Summer homes in Newport and Martha's Vineyard, a mansion on Beacon Hill, commercial properties throughout New England, stock portfolios that included founding shares in companies that became household names." She pulled out a property listing. This is the Newport house alone. Carl took the paper with shaking hands. I saw his eyes widen as he read the description. 32 rooms, oceanfront estate, 12 acres, currently valued at $45 million. This is just one property, he whispered. One of 7 primary residences, Margaret confirmed, plus the commercial holdings, the investment portfolios, and the art collection. Jessica had finally found her voice. Art collection? Margaret smiled. Monet, Renoir, several Picassos. The insurance valuation alone is over $60 million. I watched my son process this information, saw him trying to reconcile the father he'd known with the man Margaret was describing. The poor high school principal who drove a 10-year-old Toyota was actually heir to an art collection worth more than most people could comprehend. But there's more, Margaret continued, pulling out another set of documents. The Wellington Foundation, established by your grandfather, has been operating for 40 years without your father's input. They fund scholarships, medical research, disaster relief. Under the terms of the trust, if your father claims his inheritance, he also becomes chairman of a foundation that distributes approximately $20 million annually to charitable causes. Carl sank back onto the couch, his face pale. $20 million a year. To charity. Your father could have been making those decisions for decades, Margaret said, choosing which causes to support, which research to fund, which communities to help. That hit me harder than I'd expected. In my quest to give Carl a humble upbringing, I'd also deprived the world of whatever good the Wellington Foundation might have accomplished under my guidance. How many scholarships had gone unfunded? How much research had been delayed? How many disasters had the foundation been unable to respond to because they were operating on autopilot instead of having active leadership? Carl was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger anymore, or confusion. It was something closer to horror. Dad, he said slowly, when I was 16 and wanted to go on that class trip to Europe, and you said we couldn't afford it. You could have funded entire schools to take trips to Europe, Margaret said gently. When I got into Boston University, but we couldn't afford it, and I had to settle for state school. Your father could have endowed a scholarship program at Boston University, Margaret confirmed. Carl put his head in his hands. When Jessica and I were looking at houses and I was worried about the mortgage payments, your father could have bought the entire neighborhood, Margaret finished. The weight of these revelations was crushing. I'd thought I was teaching Carl values, but from his perspective, I'd deprived him of opportunities, experiences, the kind of life he'd dreamed of, and worse, I'd done it while possessing the very resources that could have given him everything he'd ever wanted. Jessica spoke for the first time since Margaret's arrival, her voice barely audible. Joseph, this morning when Carl said... She couldn't finish the sentence. When he told me to choose between a nursing home or living in my car, I finished for her. Yes, this morning, when my son decided I was too much of a burden to keep around, I was worth approximately $500 million. Carl made a sound like he'd been physically struck. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I'd known... If you'd known, you would have treated me differently, I said. That's exactly why I never told you. Margaret was watching this exchange with professional interest, but I could see something else in her expression, approval maybe, or respect for the choice I'd made, even if it had led to this painful moment. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out a final document. The deadline I mentioned. 7 days to claim the inheritance or lose it forever. That deadline isn't arbitrary. Massachusetts law requires it, but your father could simply let it pass. The money would go to various charities, the properties would be sold, and the Wellington name would effectively disappear from the family tree. Carl's head snapped up. He could just give it all away? That's exactly what I've been planning to do for 35 years, I said quietly. The room fell silent again. As the implications sank in, Carl had just learned that his father was worth $500 million, and in the same conversation he was learning that I was prepared to give every penny of it away rather than claim it. But why? Carl asked, his voice breaking. "After everything, why would you still choose to give it up?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and apparently failed in ways I was only beginning to understand. The answer to his question would determine not just my future, but whether there was any hope of rebuilding the relationship that had brought us to this devastating moment. "Because," I said, "until this morning, I thought I'd raised a son who would love me whether I had money or not. I thought the values I'd tried to teach you mattered more than the opportunities I'd kept from you." Carl flinched, as if I'd slapped him. "But now," I continued, "I'm not sure of anything anymore." Margaret closed her briefcase with a soft snap. "Perhaps," she said diplomatically, "this would be a good time for everyone to think carefully about what happens next. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown through the weekend. The deadline is Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. She stood and handed me her card. "Whatever you decide, Mr. Wellington, please call me by Monday evening." She showed herself out, leaving Carl, Jessica, and me alone with the wreckage of everything we'd thought we knew about our family. Through the window, I watched the Rolls-Royce pull away, disappearing around the corner like something from a dream. But the documents scattered across our coffee table were real enough. And somewhere in this room sat the question that would define the rest of our lives. What, if anything, was worth more than $500 million? The weekend that followed Margaret's visit was the longest of my life. Carl called in sick to work on Friday, something I'd never known him to do in his 15-year real estate career. Jessica barely spoke, moving through the house like a ghost, occasionally stopping to stare at the documents Margaret had left behind. I spent most of Saturday in my garden, tending to the tomatoes and herbs I'd planted in spring. There was something grounding about having my hands in the soil, something real about coaxing life from the earth that helped me process the magnitude of what had been revealed. But even there, I couldn't escape the weight of the decision ahead of me. Carl found me there Sunday morning, sitting on the old wooden bench I'd built myself 5 years ago. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and several days of stubble. "Dad," he said quietly, settling beside me on the bench that creaked under our combined weight. "We need to talk." I set down my coffee mug and waited. Over the past 48 hours, I'd imagined this conversation a dozen different ways. Carl apologizing, Carl demanding explanations, Carl angry that I'd deceived him. But when he finally spoke, his words caught me completely off guard. "I've been thinking about Mom," he said. I felt my breath catch. We rarely talked about Sarah. After she died, Carl had been so young, and as he grew older, the topic became too painful for both of us to navigate. "I barely remember her," Carl continued, "but I remember how she used to look at you, like you were the most important person in the world, like nothing else mattered as long as you were there." I closed my eyes, remembering Sarah's smile, the way she'd light up when I walked into a room. "I used to wonder," Carl said, his voice getting quieter, "what happened to that man? The one Mom loved so much, because the father I grew up with, he was distant, sad, like he was carrying some terrible weight." "I was," I said simply. Carl nodded. "I know that now. You weren't just grieving Mom. You were grieving the life you'd given up, the family you'd walked away from, the world you'd left behind, and you did it all for me." I turned to look at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "I also know," he continued, "that I became everything you were trying to protect me from. Shallow, materialistic, measuring worth by bank account balances. I became exactly like the people you'd escaped." The truth of that hit me like a physical blow. My son, the boy I'd raised to value character over wealth, had indeed become the very thing I'd feared. But hearing him say it, seeing the recognition in his eyes, gave me hope that maybe it wasn't too late. "Carl," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I need to say this." He took a shaky breath. "Yesterday, when that woman left, Jessica and I had the biggest fight of our marriage. She wanted me to convince you to take the money to make sure our family got a piece of it. She actually suggested I should contest any will you might write, make sure I inherited everything when you died." I felt a chill run down my spine. That's when I realized, Carl continued, that I'd married someone who saw people the same way I'd been seeing you, as assets to be managed, problems to be solved, resources to be exploited. He paused, running his hands through his hair. She didn't marry me, Dad. She married what she thought I could become, and I didn't love you. I loved what I thought you should have been. Tears were streaming down his face now, and I felt my own eyes burning. I told her I wanted you to give it all away, he said. Every penny. Because the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and sat up with me when I had nightmares, that man would never have needed money to prove his worth. And if I can't love that man without a bank statement attached, then I don't deserve to be his son. I reached over and pulled Carl into a hug, the first real embrace we'd shared in years. He sobbed against my shoulder like the little boy he'd once been, and I felt something healing between us that I'd thought was broken forever. When we finally separated, Carl wiped his eyes and gave me a watery smile. So that's my vote. Give it all away. Be the man Mom fell in love with, the man who chose principle over comfort. Don't let people like me and Jessica change who you are. I sat back, overwhelmed by my son's words. This was what I'd wanted to hear, wasn't it? Proof that the values I'd tried to instill had taken root somewhere deep inside him, even if they'd been buried under years of resentment and materialism. But as I looked at Carl, really looked at him, I saw something else. Dark circles under his eyes that spoke of more than just a sleepless weekend. A tension in his shoulders that suggested stress beyond what our family drama could account for. Carl, I said gently, is everything all right? With work, I mean? With your finances? His composure cracked just slightly. Why do you ask? Because I know you, son. I know when you're worried about something beyond what we're dealing with right now. Carl was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The market's been rough this year, really rough. I made some investments, took some risks that I thought would pay off. He looked up at me, shame written across his face. I'm in debt, Dad. Serious debt. The kind that keeps you awake at night wondering if you're going to lose everything. My heart sank. How serious? $600,000. Credit cards, business loans, a second mortgage on the house that Jessica doesn't know about. He let out a bitter laugh. Ironic, isn't it? Here you are sitting on $500 million, and I'm about to lose the house I kicked you out of. Suddenly, his cruel words from Friday morning made more sense. The stress, the anger, the desperate need to reduce expenses by getting rid of his father. Carl hadn't just been ashamed of me. He'd been drowning, and in his panic, he'd tried to throw me overboard to save himself. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Carl looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Tell you what, that your successful real estate agent's son was actually a failure? That I couldn't even manage my own finances? You would have tried to help, and we both know you didn't have anything to help with. At least I thought you didn't. I stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of my garden, looking out over the modest backyard where I'd spent so many peaceful hours. Behind me, Carl was quiet, probably thinking he'd just confessed his failures to a father who was about to walk away with more money than either of them could spend in a lifetime. But I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about the choice ahead of me, and how it had suddenly become much more complicated than principle versus pragmatism. Carl, I said, turning back to face him, what if I told you there was a third option? He looked up, confusion in his eyes. What do you mean? I walked back to the bench and sat down, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. What if I claimed the inheritance, but not for the reasons you might think? Carl was very still, waiting for me to continue. Margaret mentioned the Wellington Foundation, $20 million a year in charitable giving but operating without real leadership for 40 years. I paused, choosing my words carefully. What if someone took that responsibility seriously? What if someone used that money to actually make a difference in the world? You're talking about keeping it, Carl said slowly. I'm talking about stewarding it, I corrected, being responsible for it. using it the way it was meant to be used. Carl was quiet for a long moment, processing what I was suggesting. And what about my situation? I looked at my son, this man who had hurt me deeply but who had also just shown me that somewhere inside him lived the boy I'd raised with love and hope. That would depend, I said, on whether you're ready to earn whatever help you might receive, whether you're prepared to work for redemption rather than just expecting it to be handed to you. Carl's eyes widened as he began to understand what I was offering. Not just forgiveness, but a chance to prove himself worthy of it. "What did you have in mind?" he asked quietly. "Come with me to Boston," I said. "Meet Margaret officially. Learn about the foundation, the businesses, the responsibilities that come with the Wellington name. If you can show me that you understand what stewardship means, that you're committed to using wealth as a tool for good rather than a measure of personal worth, then maybe we can work together to build something meaningful." Carl was staring at me with an expression of amazement and hope. "You'd give me that chance? After everything I said, everything I did?" "You're my son," I said simply. "And despite everything, you just proved to me that the man I tried to raise is still in there somewhere. The question is, are you ready to let him out?" Carl didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he scrolled through his contacts and pressed a number. I watched as he held the phone to his ear, his jaw set with determination. "Jessica," he said when she answered, "we need to talk. About us, about what we both want from this marriage, and about whether we can build something real together or if we're just two people using each other." He paused, listening to her response. "No, this conversation can't wait. Come home. Now." When he hung up, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years. Respect. "When do we leave for Boston?" he asked. I smiled, feeling hope bloom in my chest for the first time in decades. "Tomorrow morning." Margaret said she'd be waiting for my call. As we sat there in my simple garden, surrounded by vegetables I'd grown with my own hands, I realized that sometimes the most important inheritances aren't left in wills or trust funds. Sometimes they're passed down through second chances, through the courage to choose love over pride, through the wisdom to understand that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we give. Tomorrow we would begin the complicated process of claiming the Wellington legacy, but today I had already reclaimed something far more precious. My son. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of the Wellington mansion on Beacon Hill, watching the Boston harbor sparkle in the late afternoon sun. The view was breathtaking, stretching from the harbor to the distant blue hills, but what took my breath away wasn't the scenery. It was the sound of Carl's voice drifting up from the garden below, where he was on a conference call with the Wellington Foundation's Education Committee. "No, I don't think we should fund that program," he was saying, his tone patient but firm. "The overhead costs are too high, and we haven't seen measurable outcomes from similar initiatives. What if we redirected those funds to the literacy program in Dorchester? The results there have been exceptional." I smiled, remembering the man who 6 months ago would have approved any proposal that made him look generous, without caring about actual impact. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy, but it had been real. The first few weeks after we'd arrived in Boston had been the hardest of both our lives. Margaret had been gracious but thorough in her introduction to the Wellington legacy. She'd walked us through every property, every investment, every charitable commitment. Carl had been overwhelmed by the scope of it all, and I'd been overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility I'd avoided for 35 years. The mansion alone had been almost too much to bear. 32 rooms filled with priceless antiques and family portraits of Wellingtons dating back to the Revolutionary War. A library containing first editions that scholars would kill to examine. Staff quarters that housed a team of people who had been maintaining the property for decades, waiting for the family to return. Carl had walked through it all in stunned silence, occasionally stopping to touch a piece of furniture or stare at a painting. In the master bedroom, he'd found a portrait of my parents that had been painted when I was about his age. He'd stood there for 20 minutes studying my father's face, looking for some resemblance to the grandfather he'd never known. "They look cold," he'd said finally. "They were," I'd replied. But it was the foundation offices that had really changed everything. Located in a brownstone in Back Bay, the Wellington Foundation occupied 4 floors of what had once been my grandfather's private offices. Margaret had walked us through each department: education, medical research, disaster relief, and community development. "Your father could have been directing all of this," she'd explained to Carl as we toured the education wing. "Instead, we've been operating on autopilot, following guidelines established decades ago but never updated, never improved." That's when Carl had asked the question that showed me he was truly ready to change. What could we have accomplished if Dad had been involved all along? The answer had been sobering. Thousands of scholarships that could have been funded, but weren't. Medical research that could have advanced faster with proper leadership. Disaster relief that could have been more efficient and effective. 35 years of missed opportunities to make a real difference in the world. Carl had thrown himself into understanding the Foundation's work with the same intensity he'd once applied to real estate. He'd read every annual report, studied every program, interviewed staff members who had been waiting decades for someone from the family to show real interest in their work. The breakthrough had come during his 3rd week, when he'd visited the scholarship recipients at a high school in Roxbury. I'd watched him talk to teenagers who had been given opportunities they never would have had without the Foundation's support. One girl, Maria, had told him how the Wellington Scholarship had allowed her to attend MIT, where she was now studying biomedical engineering. "I want to cure cancer," she'd said simply, "and your family made that dream possible." Carl had come home that night and found me in the library, reading through old Foundation records. "Dad," he'd said, settling into the chair across from me, "I understand now. This isn't about money, it's about responsibility. It's about using what we have to create opportunities for people who wouldn't have them otherwise." From that moment forward, Carl had approached the Foundation work not as an obligation or a way to earn my approval, but as a calling. He'd identified inefficiencies, proposed new programs, and begun building relationships with community leaders who had been waiting years for the Foundation to become more responsive to actual needs. The business side had been more challenging. The Wellington family had significant holdings in companies ranging from shipping to technology, and I'd had to learn quickly how to be an effective steward of those investments. Carl had surprised me by showing real aptitude for the strategic thinking required, but more importantly, he'd brought a moral compass to the decision-making process. When we'd discovered that one of our portfolio companies had questionable labor practices, Carl had been the one to insist we either force changes or divest entirely. When another company had proposed a merger that would have been profitable but would cost hundreds of jobs, Carl had argued for a different approach that protected the workers. "If we're going to be wealthy," he'd said during one particularly heated board meeting, "we're going to be ethical about it." The personal changes had been just as dramatic. Jessica had left him after 2 weeks once it became clear that Carl was serious about building a life based on service rather than status. She'd wanted the money without the responsibility, the prestige without the purpose. Carl had let her go without a fight. "I married the wrong person for the wrong reasons," he'd told me the night she moved out. "But maybe now I can become the right person for someone else someday." He'd moved into the mansion with me, not because he needed a place to live, but because we'd discovered that after 35 years of distance, we enjoyed each other's company. We had dinner together most nights, talking about the Foundation's work, the family's history, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding the relationship that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding. Carl had paid off his debts with money from a trust fund that had been established for him at birth, money he'd never known existed. But he'd insisted on earning back every penny through his Foundation work, donating his salary to causes he cared about until he'd repaid the full amount. "I want to know I deserved this," he'd explained. "I want to know I earned the right to be here." Now, 6 months later, I watched him finish his conference call and look up at the balcony where I stood. He waved, and I could see the contentment in his expression, the peace that came from meaningful work and clear purpose. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Joseph," she said when I answered, "I have news that I think you'll find interesting." "Good news or bad news?" I asked. "Good news. Exceptional news, actually." I could hear the smile in her voice. The Wellington Foundation's education initiative that Carl developed has been selected as a model program by the Department of Education. They want to implement it nationally. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with watching my son discover his true potential. "There's more," Margaret continued. "3 other major foundations have reached out about partnering with us on Carl's community development proposal. If we move forward, we could impact over 1 million lives in the next 5 years." I looked down at Carl, who was now walking through the garden, stopping to examine the roses that had been planted by my great-grandmother decades ago. He moved with purpose but without hurry, confident in his place in the world in a way he'd never been before. "Margaret," I said, "I want you to give Carl full authority over the Foundation's strategic direction. He's ready for that responsibility." There was a pause. "Are you sure? That's a $25 million annual budget." "I'm sure," I said. "He's not the man who walked into your office 6 months ago. He's become who he was meant to be." After I hung up, I remained on the balcony, watching the harbor and thinking about the journey that had brought us here. Carl's cruel words that Friday morning had felt like the end of everything, but they'd actually been the beginning of something better than I could have imagined. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Carl appeared on the balcony, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Margaret called you too?" he asked, handing me a glass. "She did. Congratulations, son. You've built something remarkable." Carl leaned against the balcony railing, looking out over the city. "We've built something remarkable," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without your example of what it means to choose principle over comfort." I thought about that for a moment. You know, for 35 years, I thought I'd made the right choice in walking away from all this. I convinced myself that poverty was more noble than wealth, that struggle was more valuable than comfort. "And now?" Carl asked. "Now I think I was half right," I said. "The wealth itself isn't evil, and poverty isn't inherently noble. What matters is what you do with whatever resources you have. You can be poor and selfish, or wealthy and generous. You can struggle and learn nothing, or have everything and use it to lift others up." Carl nodded thoughtfully. "I spent so many years resenting what I thought was your weakness, your failure to provide more. I never understood that your strength was in choosing love over money, principles over prestige." "And I never understood," I replied, "that I could honor those principles while still accepting the resources to make them more effective." We stood there in comfortable silence, father and son watching the sun begin to set over Boston Harbor. The city spread out before us, full of people whose lives were being touched by the work we were doing together. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down and saw it was from Maria, the MIT student Carl had met in Roxbury. "Mr. Wellington," the message read, "I just wanted you to know that I got into the graduate program at Harvard Medical School. Thank you for believing in me. I'm one step closer to that cancer cure. Your family's investment in my education is going to change the world." I showed the message to Carl and watched his face light up with the kind of joy that no amount of money could buy. "This," he said quietly, "this is what it's all about." I put my arm around my son's shoulder, feeling the weight and warmth of our restored relationship. 6 months ago, Carl had told me to choose between a nursing home and living in my car. Today we stood together in a mansion that had been in our family for generations, planning how to use our inherited wealth to create opportunities for people like Maria. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Carl had gained everything he'd thought he wanted: money, status, luxury, but only after learning to value things that couldn't be bought. And I had finally claimed the inheritance I'd run from for 35 years, but only after discovering that wealth could be a tool for good rather than a corruption of the soul. As the last light faded from the harbor, Carl and I went inside to plan tomorrow's foundation meetings. There were scholarships to award, programs to develop, lives to change. We had work to do, and for the first time in either of our lives, we were doing it together. The Wellington legacy would continue, but it would be built on love rather than obligation, on service rather than entitlement, on the understanding that true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give away. And in the end, that made all the difference.